Okay then, hello and welcome to another episode of the AUBG Office Hours podcast. Today's guest in this early session, 9 a.m. in the morning, is Professor Sean Homer. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
We start with the usual questions. Let's get straight into it. Tell me about your education.
My education. How far do you want me to go back?
Maybe not high school, but
No.
yeah.
Okay, my first diploma and my first degree was in art. I was a photographer and filmmaker, did performance arts. So I did in the UK, you used to do what's called a foundation year, which is a 1-year diploma, and then you would go on to art school. So I went to art school to study film and photography, and I made films, experimental films, and I then dropped out after the first year. We spent much of our time occupying the university and demonstrating about one thing and another, and I decided that I could simply make the films on my own. I didn't need to. In those days, in the 1970s, in art schools, they didn't really teach you anything. You just kind of turned up and there was a room full of equipment and you did things if you felt like it. So I felt I could do this outside of the university, so I left. And I continued making films and taking photographs for a while. And later, I would go back to study. I decided to go back to study literature. But again, this was after quite a long period. I went back and then I studied English literature, single honours degree in English literature, and then I did my Ph.D. in Comparative Literature from the University of Sheffield.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. We'll get back to it. My next question is, how long have you been at AUBG?
I've been here since 2010, so I've been here 13 years now.
Okay, in which department do you teach?
I teach in the Literature and Theatre department, and I'm chair of the department as well. So.
That's nice. And what courses do you teach?
Like all of us, I teach the composition sequence, which is your favorite classes. I know that you all love these classes. And then I now divide my time between teaching half film and half literature. So I teach the intro to literature. I teach elective courses on modernism and postmodernism, and also psychoanalysis in literature. I teach the introduction to film, the film criticism course, and also teach courses in Balkan Cinema and psychoanalysis in cinema.
Those are a lot of courses. Where my next question, maybe you can synthesize the main skills and maybe knowledge that students obtain from taking these courses.
I think the main skills that people take from my courses are analytical skills. The ability to, what I try to teach is how to analyze texts. Some of you here maybe have done my Intro to Lit and my film criticism class, and what you will know is that I am adamant that I do not want you to interpret texts. Okay, I try to stop you interpreting texts, and I try to get you to analyze texts by looking at what texts do. So my main skill, I think, that I teach is how to analyze the text, and from that we can read it.
Why do you not want us to interpret it?
Well, because interpretation involves you often with preconceived ideas, speculating on what the text might mean. I'm not really interested in what things mean. I'm interested in what things do. So I try to teach you to analyze what a text is doing. If a text makes you respond in a certain way, how does it make you respond in that way? That is what the text means, what it does, not what you can speculate on, what the author intended or what something might mean or what something might symbolize. These things I'm not really very interested in.
So if I'm able to summarize, it's about how the student reacts. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes, I do. My courses really are a combination of close reading, so a kind of formal analysis and close reading, and what used to be called, or what probably still is called, reader response theory. That is to say, your own response as a reader or as a spectator, and analysing how a text makes you respond in that way. So I do a combination of the two, really.
I personally haven't taken any of the literature courses with you, but how do you see that maybe reaction in the students that have taken these courses? So what is, how should I phrase the question? How do they react? How do you see this in class? That's
some with horror. I am aware that, yes, some students react with horror to my courses. I think the overall response is by trying to teach students how to analyze texts, perhaps for the first time, they begin to have a sense that they can articulate how they feel about something, and that is the main response I think I get. Certainly informally, this is the response I get back. That students feel after taking my classes that they have, for the first time in some cases, like the film, they understand how to talk about a film. They understand how to analyze a film. They understand how to start breaking a film down into its constituent parts, its different elements that go together to make up the overall style and the feel of a film. So there's the response, I think, is that I provide, particularly through the introductory classes, the students with a vocabulary with which to articulate how they respond to a film. Why they actually like certain films and don't like other films, why they like some directors and not other directors. They can begin to actually articulate this in a kind of intelligent and meaningful way.
Okay, and in the more specialized courses, you said modernism, was that correct?
Modernism, postmodernism, the courses in psychoanalysis and the courses in Balkan cinema, yes.
Yes, how do they, maybe because I'm guessing they're more specific and more advanced, how do they differ in the essential knowledge you're trying to transmit? Or?
Well, they do. As you say, they are more specialized, they're more delimited. They're not sort of broad survey courses like the two introductory courses. So I am trying to I teach different things in each course. So modernism is really concerned with that kind of radical transformation of time, space, and subjectivity at the beginning of the 20th century. My postmodernism course is looking at the more contemporary world of science, digital media, proliferation of narratives and things that we have today. The psychoanalysis courses obviously deal directly with psychoanalysis. The history course, the Balkan Cinema course, deals with the representation of history on film. And this is interesting because, of course, I'm a complete outsider here, which is why I started teaching this course in Balkan Cinema. But also one of the interesting things I find is that, although many of the students are from the region, you know very little about your own film history. So teaching this course is really enlightening because, for the first time, many of you are looking at your own film history, your own cinema history.
I was very interested to know about this course specifically because it really is something that from an outsider's perspective, can be related in a different way. Can you elaborate a little more, maybe tell me a little more detail about this course?
Well, the films I study are really from the 1990s, mainly from the 1990s upwards, and this is in part because this is when I started watching Balkan cinema. So this was this was the beginning of my knowledge with directors like Kusturica or Angelopoulos and things like this. I started seeing these films in the UK for the first time. And also, this coincided, of course, with the breakup of the former Yugoslavia and my interest in that period of time. When I moved to Greece in 2000, I became interested in the issues, the kind of issues, territorial issues between Greece, North Macedonia, Bulgaria, stuff like this. So I started looking at films in this area as well. It deals with contemporary films, or recent films. I wouldn't say contemporary. Recent films now. They're quite old for you lot. And it addresses the way that different historical issues are addressed on film. And what I'm interested in is the kind of narrative structures and narrative scenarios which are used to represent historical situations, and particularly in the way that the kind of narrative choices that one makes will impact your understanding of those historical events.
I understand. And most of these, are they historical films? Like they aim to be non-fictitious to represent reality, or they meant to also...
You clearly haven't done any of my courses.
I haven't.
If you would know the first thing is I'm not really interested in reality very much. Okay. They are not historical. Some of them are historical films. The majority of them are not. I am interested in films which have a more tangential relation to what they represent. Some of them, I begin the course with Kusturica's Underground, which obviously is a historical film about the history of the former Yugoslavia. But at the same time, it is a fragmented narrative. It's divided into 3 parts, which are very repetitive. So I'm interested in more experimental, or what you might call, or what have been called, oppositional films, which try to revisit history in different ways. So I also look, for example, at the Romanian New Wave films of, say, 2006 to 2015, this period of time. And none of these films are directly about history. They're about everyday events in Romania. But what I look at and what I explore there is the traces of history within the everyday. So I'm not looking specifically at historical films. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, maybe we can move back a little bit to maybe your studies, and I'm interested to hear maybe about your upbringing, what got you into art and cinema in the first place, into filmmaking.
To be honest, I was a terrible student at school. I never really, it never made much sense to me being at school. What I liked doing was making art, and this is what I did. Spent most of my time making art. For people of my age, a certain generation of people like me, a key event was the mid-70s, the arrival of punk in 76, when this exploded into the UK. So I started to become a photographer. I was photographing many of the early punk bands. I was photographing, the big, huge Rock Against Racism marches in London and the big concerts. I did a couple of small, single sleeve designs for local bands in Bristol and stuff like this, and some publicity shots for different bands. So I was doing a lot of photography. This is what got me into art school. And in art school, I started making experimental films. So I was never particularly interested in making mainstream narrative fiction films. I was interested in performance art, making 16mm, 8mm films. So I would do, I would do this kind of thing. And this was a time when we did a lot of we pre-digital days where we had celluloid and we used to scratch and draw on the film frame by frame and play with it and do all these kinds of things. I started I started on 16mm and then I moved back to 8mm, which was essentially the very small cameras that people bought to record their holidays, because you didn't need much equipment. So you could buy 8mm cameras cheaply, projectors, editing suites. You could buy all of this really cheaply and you could do it at home. So we started making these 8mm films. And exhibiting them in different kind of performance arts setup. And I was doing this for quite some time, and that seemed to be fine. And I could do things, I could make things visually, I could do performances and different stuff, and people liked what I did. What I found difficult was, what I always found difficult was to articulate what I was doing. I found it very hard to talk about what I was doing, or to say what I was doing, or to explain what I was doing. And so I started to become more and more interested in thinking theoretically around what I was doing, looking at art history, looking at film history. And I very slowly at art school, I became more and more interested in the kind of academic side of it rather than making it, because I could make things, but I couldn't talk about them very well. And I wanted to be able to talk about what I was doing as well. So I slowly sort of drifted more to the academic side of things.
And then that led you to literature? Or?
No, that led me to various places in Europe. I lived in Paris for a while, and I actually told my students told me I was showing off the other day, because we were talking about, I can't remember what film we were talking about, and said, yes, I remember this when I was living in this little garret in Montmartre in Paris. And they sort of said, you're just showing off now, aren't you? And I said, well, no, if I wanted to show off, I would talk about when I lived in a squat in Montparnasse or a brothel in Pigalle. That would be showing off. So now I'm showing off. So I lived in Paris for a while, about 14 months. I was making films there. I went to stay with friends in Germany and spent time in Germany. And I was reading more and more. And in Germany, I was staying with some friends in Oldenburg, and there was a half-built university library there. And I spent 3 months sat in this library reading. And that's what determined me to return to the UK. So I returned to the UK, but I didn't go back to study yet. I became a social worker.
In what?
A social worker. I worked with... It's a very convoluted story.
I have time.
I worked with severely disabled children, looking after children. I did this for 3-4 years. And I worked as what is called a residential social worker. I wanted some experience of working with people. My thinking at the time was to become an art therapist. So I was thinking of combining what I had already done in terms of being an artist with my interest in psychoanalysis and loosely psychiatry to become an art therapist. And this was the plan. So I needed experience of working with people. I already had some experience of working with homeless teenagers in a hostel for the homeless. So I became I became a residential social worker, and I did this for 4 years. And it was around that time that, with the nudging of a friend of mine, I decided to go and study literature, because I was living in a big house in Sheffield with lots of people, and I was working, I was reading. I was actually going to academic conferences. I was going to conferences on Brecht and different things like this. And eventually a friend of mine in the house just sort of said to me, he said, "Sean," he said, "people like you." I said, "Yeah." He said, "People like you usually go to university." I said, "What?" He said, "Well, people like you, who are interested in these things, they usually go to university and study." I went, "Oh, I've never thought of that." So I went to Sheffield University. I went to the English department because it seemed to me that reading literature is probably the most wonderful thing to do in the world. It's also one of the most useless and things you can possibly think of doing. So it seemed to me to be the ideal thing to do, because there was no way I'd ever get a job if I studied literature. So I went to the English department of Sheffield University, and I knocked on the door, and I sort of said, "Well, I'd like to come here, please." And they said, "No, you can't." So I went home, and my friend sort of said, "Well, did you go to the university?" I said, "Yeah." They said, "No." I said, "No, that's not how you get into university." He said, "You've got to go back, explain your situation to them." I was a mature student. I was older than 26 at the time. He said, "You explain that you're a mature student, because I don't have the qualifications. I never had the qualifications to go to university because I went to art school." So he said, "You go back, you explain your situation to them, you tell them you're a mature student, and there's an access route into the university." So I went back the following week, knocked on the door again, and sort of said, "Well, actually, I'm a mature student." And
Did you actually knock on the door? Sorry for interrupting.
Well, yeah, there was an office, and I had to knock on the door. It was an old Victorian building. I had to knock on the door to get them to let me in. So I went back, and they sort of said, "Okay, yes, you're right. There is an access course." And so I did this. I did an evening class for a year, which was an access course for mature students, and then they let me into the university, and I never left. I've been in the university ever since.
I get it.
I keep expecting at some point someone to throw me out, because I'm not supposed to be here. But I mean, no one has thrown me out yet, so I just stay. As long as I can stay, that's fine.
Wow.
You asked about my education.
I'm very interested. Okay. At any point, because you said literature is the most useless thing you get a job.
Yeah.
At any point, did someone discourage you from, pursuing art, pursuing these things?
When I was around about 15, my parents, of course, wanted me to get a job or something, or to study something which would enable me to get a job. So they had friends who were in the construction industry and were quantity surveyors and things like that. The strange thing about me is at high school I could do two things. I could do art and I could do maths. These were the two skills that I had, all right? Which is a strange combination. And so they wanted me to utilize my maths and become some kind of surveyor or quantity surveyor or something like this. So they were encouraging me to sort of go in that direction. Luckily, I decided that at some point, I really, really didn't like or didn't get maths anymore. I managed to fail my A-level, and that really saved me. So at that point, this combination of factors, really, one was a kind of the emergence of punk, and the other was a failure of my maths A-level saved my life.
From becoming boring, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and after that, I simply, from that point on, I simply pursued what I wanted to pursue.
I'm guessing this is what you wished to do with your life? You don't regret not going the other route?
Are you serious?
And that's
you know what? Of course I don't regret it. I mean, you know, my job is to read books and watch films and to talk to people about them. Can you possibly think of anything better to spend your life doing?
I don't think there is. So I want to get back to the Sheffield admission. So back then you didn't send any resume, no CV, no nothing. You just went there, asked to let you in. Wow. Okay.
Well, they didn't let in those times in the 1980s there were what were called mature access courses for non-standard students. So because I didn't have the qualifications to go to a university, and because I was older than 26. I actually went to when I went to the university, I took my first child with me in a pram. So I actually went to the university, knocked on the door with a child in a pram and said, "Will you let me in?" And so they had these mature, and most of these access courses are now closed down, which is a shame because it stops mature students, older students, it stops working class students from getting into university. But in those days you could. So I had to complete this access course, which was essentially a 1 year long evening class. And at the end of it, on the basis of this, then they interviewed me. I was called in for an interview at the, within the department, and on the basis of this, they agreed to let me in.
Okay. I want to shift towards, you mentioned punk bands.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you can tell me about your favorite punk bands and your taste in music. How about that?
My taste in music is I think the more unlistenable a band is, the more interesting it is. So I tend to like music which is pretty abrasive and not very listenable. This is my favorite form of music. Unfortunately, my family don't let me listen to it very much anymore. So for the moment, for example, the most interesting thing I've heard recently would be More Mother. I don't know if you know More Mother from the US. She's pretty good, and she has a very good album with this London-based duo Orbital, which I kind of quite like. It's worth checking out. It's called Wrecked. But I suppose for me and for many people like me, punk was a very short and a very specific moment in time. So it was really from the summer of 1976 to the summer of 1977. This was it, and after that it was over, and we stopped listening to. So I have I have all the early punk singles like The Damned and The Clash and the Sex Pistols, and I still have these at home in a box. And very occasionally people let me play them. But when all the bands, by 77, when all the bands started to sign up to big record labels, I and many of the people from my milieu stopped listening to them. So we never listened to, I have a couple of the albums, the first Clash album, the first Generation X album, but never really listened to it very much. I didn't like the albums and I didn't like the bands once they'd signed. We then moved on very, very quickly to listen. We were always listening to reggae anyway. I'm from Bristol, and Bristol, I used to live near St. Paul's in Bristol, and St. Paul's is one of the oldest black communities, along with Toxteth in Liverpool, because these were the two ports where the slave trade went through. So we had one of the oldest black communities in the UK, going back hundreds and hundreds of years. So there was a lot of reggae clubs and bands. So we were listening to reggae, we were listening to jazz, an awful lot of jazz. So we moved by 77, 78, I didn't listen to punk anymore. I listened only to reggae, jazz, free jazz, experimental jazz, and this kind of thing. This is what we're listening to. Of the post-punk bands, Joy Division was the only one I kind of adored. I listened to Joy Division endlessly for many, many years, and it's my big regret is I actually never went to see Joy Division. So that really annoyed me. They played in Sheffield when I was there. They played at the Lead Mill, this club in Sheffield. But the same night, there were two clubs in Sheffield. And one night, Joy Division was playing at one club, and Prince Farai, this reggae artist, was playing at the other club. And I had to decide which one to go and see. And I thought, okay, I'll see Joy Division later. I'll go and see Prince Farai this time. And I went to see Prince Farai, and he was terrible, really awful. And shortly after that, Ian Curtis killed himself. So I then never got to see Joy Division, and I'm upset. And this is one of my few regrets in life was I made the wrong decision of which band to go and see.
I'm kind of sad that I don't know most of these names and I can't really grasp it, but I'm interested to hear more about what was it like to listen to music back then. So to go to these events, we have concerts today as well, but I guess
well, you've got to keep in mind. Okay, I actually started. I went to my first concert at the age of 12. My parents took me to see T-Rex, and I thought, wow, this is great, So I went to see T-Rex at the age of 12, and from that point on, I was going to see every band that played in Bristol. So I saw pretty much everyone. I saw all the big heavy metal bands, multiple times, Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, all of these things. I saw Pink Floyd 3 times. I saw Led Zeppelin play. I saw Rolling Stones. I saw all of these big, huge bands I saw. And by the mid-70s, of course, I went to see the Led Zeppelin Swan Song tour in Earl's Court in London when they played it, their last tour. And then I heard, then we heard on the radio The Damned, the first Damned single. What was it? Neat, 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 which was the first on Rough Trade. This was the first punk single ever released. Okay, and I saw The Damned play at Bristol Students' Union, and it was amazing. You had never seen any, going from these huge stadiums where, I saw the Rolling Stones at Nebworth, for example. I saw, as I just said, Led Zeppelin at Earl's Court, massive, tens and tens of thousands of people. And then we were seeing in these tiny, tiny clubs, tiny bars, like the Stage Bar here, like the All Stars. We were seeing, the punk bands playing, not on stages, but on, just there in the bar. And suddenly you had these amazing bands playing. And it was incredible. Tiny, tiny places, 100 people there and stuff like this. This is why I keep pointing out to students, this is also why I'm going deaf. This is permanent hearing damage from being in these clubs. And I've never, ever gone to a big rock concert again. I've never seen any, and won't go to any major rock concerts again. I've never been to any since, not since the mid-70s. I only go and see bands in small places.
Why?
Because it's better.
Okay.
It's boring. Actually, no, I'm lying. I am telling. I did go and see. Yeah, I am lying. Actually, sorry. I went to see Nick Cave, and there were quite a few thousand people at Nick Cave. And also recently, I went to see a few years back. I went to see Massive Attack, and that was a pretty big concert as well. But really, I don't go to big concerts anymore at all. So.
One last thing about the music. Why was this period between 76 and 77 the punk explosion, if we can say that? Why was it so defining and so important?
Why? For me personally,
Yeah.
or for...
Well, for your generation, I guess.
Because it got us away from the pomposity of big rock bands. So, for example, you know, the last time I saw Pink Floyd, I mean, they were just had this huge entourage, this massive stage set, and it was all about how great they could play and how skillful they were as guitarists. And the great thing about punk was, I mean, when, you know, the first time I saw the Slits, which was 76, 77, they couldn't play a single note. They were fabulous. They just made a complete racket, okay? They were our age, probably, actually Ari Up was younger. She was a year or two younger than me at the time. She just screamed and wailed and thrashed around on the stage. They were fabulous. It was the sense that people could make their own art. And really, this is why I say this was changing for me. And then, so I started making, I didn't feel that I needed to become a big filmmaker or so. I could make these Super 8 films. I could take my own photographs. I could develop them. We could do our own thing. We could make our own clothes. We could make our own art or whatever. So it was this complete change of ethos to a do-it-yourself kind of culture where people just did their own thing. And if you weren't very good at it, it didn't really matter that much either, because it was often better. Okay, so for many of us, it was very defining in that sense, because it also gave us that space to go off and do our own things, to make our own art.
That's great to hear. Okay. Maybe we can jump back into literature now. Not that it is. Well, yeah. Sure. Well, I wanted to ask, maybe from your perspective, because you said you have the best job, that is reading and watching films. Why would maybe I know here we have a literature major. Some people do study it. What's your thought on why people should study this subject?
Because they want to. There's no other. Okay. What is the purpose of being at a university? What is the purpose of studying? Our purpose here, you know, I've never done anything with the intention of ending up with a job or a promotion, or I do what I want to do. I pursue my own desire. For me, okay, we live in a very utilitarian world. We live in a world which is dominated by numbers and economics. And I'm interested in this as well. As most of my students know, I spend quite a bit of time reading economics. I think it's important. But for me, it is art and literature and film which makes life worth living. Why should people study these things? Because they want to, and it's a worthwhile thing to do. If people don't study them, if people don't write, if people don't make art, this world is going to be a very dull and very boring place.
Okay.
Now you want to become a literature major, right?
No,
Hmm?
I want to take a course with Professor Homer. That's what I want to do now. When I was looking through some of the publications or the peer-reviewed articles, I'm not sure if it was an article or an essay, I stumbled onto one that caught my eye. The Roma do not exist. Can you tell me a little bit more about that one?
Yes. I've actually, this is a paper about a film by a French-Algerian Roma director called Tony Gatliff. And the film is about this young Frenchman who goes to Romania to try and track down a singer. He doesn't know who the singer is, but he has a tape, a recording, an old tape recording of her voice, and this singer was his father's favorite singer, and his father died. So this is a film I saw in the UK before I moved to the Balkans. I was very interested in it. The idea the Roma do not exist comes from a slogan by the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, which is, "The woman does not exist." All right? And for many feminists, they took this to mean that women do not exist. Well, this is not what he's saying. He's saying the woman does not exist. The ideal woman does not exist. The ideal other who can fulfill all our needs does not exist. And actually, if we try, and when he came up with this concept, he was looking at medieval courtly love poetry. And if you read medieval courtly love poetry, what you see is this sort of idealization of the woman, this placing of the woman on a pedestal who is perfect and so beautiful that she becomes completely inhuman. Okay, so the ideal woman doesn't exist. So what I was interested in with this paper was the idea that because Roma cinema is very prevalent in the Balkans, every nation within the Balkans, the Roma are singularly the most discriminated minority within Europe, okay? But at the same time, they're an object of fascination and romanticism by film directors. So Serbia, North Macedonia, Greece, Bulgaria, you see films about the Roma. And often the discussion about these films is on the authenticity of the representation of Roma culture and life. And what I wanted to argue in this paper is that this is, in a sense, a category mistake, because films never truly represent anything. They are fiction, they are representations of something. And to be absolutely honest, the vast majority of us know very little about Roma culture, Romani culture and life, and therefore we're not in a position to say whether or not it's authentic. And in fact, like any other group, the Roma are not a homogenized group of people. They're not all the same. They do not exist in the way that we imagine them. This is not to say that Romani people do not exist. Clearly, they exist, but the Roma as a kind of homogenized group that we stereotype and think we represent do not exist. This is a kind of imaginary construct that we make. So that paper was my first attempt to articulate this, and I subsequently wrote a second paper on the film called The Voice as Objet Petit A, which is a Lacanian analysis of the voice within, the role of the voice within the film. And that for me is probably a better articulation of what I was thinking about with that film. What pleased me about that paper was that it was picked up by a number of Roma rights organizations and translated and reprinted in their they were non-academic, they were activist journals, reprinted this paper. And also the paper was translated into Portuguese as part of a Romani film festival in Brazil. So I was very pleased, I was pleased that paper actually had a wider audience amongst activists, which is always nice when that happens.
In explaining this, you mentioned articulation, and I got reminded when in the beginning you said that what drove you into the theoretical, into academia, I guess, was this need to, or desire to be able to explain what you're creating. Maybe can you give me a little crash course on how that developed as, you delved into academia, this ability to articulate and explain works from the point you started when you were just making films?
Well, my first attempts were terrible. As I say, the very first essay I wrote for this mature access course into the university, the professor just basically put a line through 1/3 of the essay and said, cut all of this out, it's completely irrelevant. The first presentations I did were disasters. It took me quite some time to find my feet and to be able to do that. And really, I suppose for me, again, if you think of these sort of pivotal moments in one's life, things that impacted and changed it, one of them was obviously punk. The other was for me the discovery of critical theory, and it was through the reading of this kind of theoretical discourse, critical theory, that I began to find a way of saying and talking about what I wanted to talk about in relation to texts. And this combined with a kind of formal analysis of text, allowed me to do it. So it was really, I know here, we often talk about it here in AUBG, there is quite a strong kind of anti-theoretical feeling amongst the students that things should be practical, that things should be applied. For me, I don't see why. I think there is a role for theoretical discourse, and the distance that the theoretical discourse sets up from the object and allows that kind of critical distance on it. I do not think knowledge has to be applied. I do not think it has to be immediately useful. I don't think we just teach skills. We teach thinking. We teach analytical skills. We teach critical thinking. Our job is to think analytically and to think critically. We need vocabularies. We need discourses to do that in. And it's that discovery of those discourses which is important.
Okay, and as you say, the role here, or maybe the focus is put on practicality instead of theoretical. And I know you mentioned earlier about the role of a university. Like, what is a university about? So, from what I'm getting in your mind, it's also about just delving into some subject and becoming knowledgeable about it, and focusing on the theoretical stuff of just knowing stuff instead of necessarily applying it.
No. I think no, I don't.
Okay.
I don't agree with that.
I tried.
I think for me, it's not about knowing stuff. It's about learning what we do not know, and it is a continuous process of learning how little we know and how much there is to know. So the whole process here, I think when you go into a university, you have this kind of idea that, you already think you're clever because you've got your entry requirements and you've got your grades and you've got this and that and the other. So you know stuff. And then you come to university and you think there's a bit more. You'll come out with your major and you will be an expert in this. I think if university education is to work, it is a gradual process of stripping away that certainty that we know something to constantly reveal what we do not know. So the process of teaching, the process of learning is to really get a sense of how little we know. And the more we read and the more we know, the more we realize, in fact, we don't know. So it's in a sense, it's the opposite of the way that you formulated that.
Yeah.
And I don't think, I mean, for me, the university is not about imparting knowledge. You can Google it. It's not difficult. Now you just do it on ChatGPT. It has nothing to do with the imparting of knowledge or simply the gaining of knowledge. And of course, there are certain things that one wants to, in my film course, in my film criticism, I show a series of classic films because I kind of think you should watch them. I don't care whether you like them or not, but I think you should watch them. So we do that. But it's not around this. It's around learning a process of... someone walked in and I just lost my train of thought. It's around that process of having a kind of what would I say? Okay, you have to edit that bit out because someone's just walked in and interrupted me.
What were we talking about?
Why do we need to watch these classic movies?
Because they're often reference points. That we come back to. When we watch, when you watch a film director like Tarantino, for example, many scenes in Tarantino are direct quotations from earlier films. And if you're really to have a sense of what Tarantino is doing, you need to be able to think, so he's referring back to Psycho in that film. He's referring back to something else in that film. And this opens, the process of analysis of a text is always to open a text up, to increase the levels of significance of that text. It is never to say, this text means that. This is the moral of this. It's to open a text up to multiple readings. And you can read good texts, you can always read in multiple ways.
Can you name some of the films, the classical films?
Well, I show things like Citizen Kane, for example. I show The Wizard of Oz. I show The Third Man. Films like Now Voyager, melodramas from the 1950s, wonderful melodramas from the 1950s, like Now Voyager or Brief Encounter and stuff like this. These are all great. Psycho, Hitchcock. I mean, for your generation, for example, many of you have never watched any Hitchcock films. But he's central. He's an important figure. And then, of course, I always inflict Bellatar on all my students because, well, you signed up for the class, so you need to suffer.
Bellatar.
Bellatar is a contemporary Hungarian director. He's just stopped making films. He's famous for making slow black and white movies in which nothing happens. And I did screen one of his films a couple of years ago, Satan's Tango, which is 7.5 hours long.
I heard about that one.
Yeah,
I heard about it.
Yeah.
Torture mechanisms.
Well, I did offer to take any student who could sit through the whole 7.5 hours out to dinner and pay for all the food and drink, so...
Quite an offer. Do you have a favorite film?
I have favorite directors. I'm interested in European art directors, so I do like... Bellatar is one of my favorite directors of all time. Theo Angelopoulos, Tarkovsky, filmmakers like this, kind of European art directors are the kinds of films that I like.
You mentioned film and theater. Or film and literature. Do you watch theater? Are you interested in?
I do watch theater when I can. when I can. I see the student productions when I can. I like theatre a lot, and I enjoy going to theatre. So now in this part of the world, if there's performances in English, I go to it. But I used to go to theatre much more in the UK. It's good, yeah.
Okay. We're almost at the end of it. I want to get your... you already mentioned plenty of good advice, but what would be one advice you would give to the students?
I never give advice.
You never give advice?
I get asked this every year for the... I get asked this every year for the student yearbook, and I always say no. I don't think one should give advice. I don't think, and if I had to give advice, the only thing I would say is to follow your desire. I don't have anything else to add to that. That seems to me what we should do.
You heard that? Thank you, Professor, for being with me here and talking to me. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been fun.
Yeah, it is. See you next time.